Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and normally on a Monday we would be doing our live stream with Peter. Peter, unfortunately, is still unwell. He's been in hospital. He had some eye surgery, but he's very much on the mend. He will be discharged from the hospital tomorrow, so I think he'll be back in action later on in the week. In the meantime, I'll carry on as per usual. So, what I want to just talk about briefly in this podcast is developments in the United Kingdom. So we've talked a lot here about the various populist movements in Europe, um, and in particular in Germany, in France, in Hungary, in Romania, in Slovakia, and and the meaning of these populist movements. But we haven't talked about the United Kingdom. And there's a good reason for that, because the UK is notoriously uh, inhospitable to populist movements. It has its two-party system. There's a kind of a third party, a kind of the liberal social democratic party, but by and large, the two main political parties, the Conservatives and Labour, dominate that governance, and very hard for anyone to break through, and particularly hard for populists. However, things did change after the Brexit referendum in 2016, which was indeed a triumph for populism, even though there wasn't really any particular populist movements that was specifically identified with the movement to leave the European Union. The one person there was Nigel Farage, but Nigel Farage was a member of the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, and notoriously he had failed time and time again to win any by-election in the UK. He'd stand in one constituency after another, and he just couldn't get in. He got into the European Parliament, but he couldn't get into Westminster. However, things have changed, and we have an election coming up. Well, it's not a general election, but it's a local election. There's a mayoral election. There's a by-election, and that's going to take place on Thursday. And Nigel Farage's party, Reform UK, is on course to do extremely well. I think the media are all in agreement that this is going to be a spectacular blowout breakthrough victory for Nigel Farage. And clearly, this is a matter of some interest. Does this portend a great political change in the United Kingdom? Because Nigel Farage is the closest that Britain has produced to a Marine Le Pen in France, to the Alternative for Deutschland. They don't have anyone terribly charismatic at the head of the AfD, but somebody like Viktor Orban, or we had the populist Călin Georgescu in Romania, but he was, of course, kicked off the ballot, and he's threatened with criminal prosecution. But Farage obviously is a different kettle of fish, because Farage is very English. He's very playful, good-humored, very much goes along with the system. He's not somebody who really wants to knock everything over. He's no wild-eyed radical. Now, according to the polls, Reform UK is the number one party. So Reform UK running about 25% in the polls, and Labour is running at something like 23%, and the Tories are around 21%. So if these numbers hold up, then reform should do really well. Now, reform, much like the populist parties in Europe, more or less focuses on immigration. Immigration is the big issue. There was obviously the UKIP, out of which reform grew, even though UKIP is still around, but basically that was, Farage's earlier incarnation. Then he had the Brexit Party, and now it's Reform UK. So that issue is now pretty much over. There's no point in debating exit from the European Union. That's already been accomplished. So immigration is his main issue. Now the question is still, can he achieve a real breakthrough? So those of us of an older generation will remember the emergence of a third party in the early 1980s, which did portend a major shakeup of the British political system. And that was the party of the Social Democratic Party. It was led by Roy Jenkins, and he had alongside him David Owen, the former Foreign Secretary, Shirley Williams, the former, she was Education Secretary, she may have been Home Secretary, and William Rogers. And now the Social Democratic Party emerged in the kind of late 1970s, early 1980s as an antidote to Labour that was seen to have gone too far to the left. After the departure of Harold Wilson and then of James Callaghan, and then the rise to the leadership of Michael Foot, there were people within the Labour Party who thought, well, Labour had just simply embraced too radical an agenda, and there was no real means within the party to return it to the more centrist course that it had pursued during the 1950s and 1960s under Hugh Gaitskell in the 50s, and then Harold Wilson in the 1960s, and to a certain extent James Callaghan in the 1970s. And so that signified a split within the Labour Party. And it really hurt Labour considerably, because essentially the Social Democrats emerged as a centrist party that the British middle classes could get behind, in the way that they would have difficulties getting behind a kind of a radical leftist party led by Michael Foot or Tony Benn. And initially, this party led by Roy Jenkins and David Owen and Shirley Williams was very popular. Was winning one by-election after another, also winning local elections, but eventually it faded out. Now, it wasn't in a way an answer to the moment, because recall, yes, there was the Labour Party had moved sharply to the left, but the Tories under Margaret Thatcher had pursued a quite radical domestic agenda. I mean, the pursuing a kind of, at least in its early days, a kind of monetarist policy, high interest rates to try to squeeze inflation out of the economy, and an end to the subsidies for industries. This, of course, led to a deindustrialization of Britain and led to very high unemployment. And so the government was extremely unpopular. The betting was in the early 1980s that Margaret Thatcher would lose the next election. And then, lo and behold, miracle for Thatcher, there was the war in the Falklands. Britain won easily, of course it would, against Argentina. And a triumphant Thatcher was re-elected overwhelmingly in 1983. And that really began the demise of the Social Democratic Party. Eventually, it amalgamated within the Liberal Party, and so it became the Liberal Democrats. But what it was trying to do then was to steer a middle course between two very unpopular alternatives. The unpopular alternative of kind of a socialist Labour Party, so essentially Labour, pursuing a kind of socialist agenda that it hadn't promised to do in decades, and the Tory party that was, basically with the task of deindustrializing the country, with a view to breaking the power of the unions. I mean, the unions had been as a bane in Britain, or it was seen to be a bane in Britain in the 1960s and 70s. And the Tories more or less promised that they would break the power of the unions. And deindustrialization is the easiest way to break the power of the unions, because if there are no jobs, then obviously there are no union members. So that's that. So that was the promise of the Social Democratic Party. Well, we're not going to go in the extreme left, and we're not going to do the extreme right. We just want to maintain that the status quo as it was in the glorious days of the 1960s under Harold Wilson's Labour. And for a while, that seemed appealing, but the interest in this faded away. Now, Farage is in a way doing something similar, because while obviously he is not doesn't want to return to any kind of a status quo, he's more of an anti-establishment person. He is exploiting the weaknesses and disarray within the Tory party, much as the SDP in the 1980s was exploiting the weaknesses and disarray within Labour. As the Tories that have failed, the Tories have clearly not been able to deliver on anything, and the economy is clearly in a dire straits. But above all, they failed on their signature issue, which was immigration, because immigration to the United Kingdom is quite staggering. It is pretty much the biggest issue in the UK, and Tories, they were in power for 14 years and didn't address the problem at all, and they got absolutely hammered in the general election last year. So hence the rise of reform. Why they did so well in the general election last year was that they ate into the Tory support. The Tories moved away from the Conservative Party and drifted to reform. It wasn't enough to generate too many seats in the House of Commons because of this Britain's peculiar political voting system, whereby you really have to get 25, 30, 40% of a vote in order to get MPs into the House of Commons. If you don't, however well you do, you get 20%, you're not going to get too many MPs there. And I think that's what happened to reform. But now things have improved. Labour is very unpopular. Keir Starmer really got off to a disastrous start, particularly in his ham-fisted, nasty response to the riots of last summer, and the understandable response to the murder of 3 young girls. He clearly was tone deaf, didn't know how to address the problem, and he really never recovered from that. So the Labour is very unpopular, but the Tories are even more unpopular. So Farage is clearly on course to push aside the Tories as really the opposition party, or at least that's what he says. So now we have to say, well, will reform achieve what Roy Jenkins' Social Democratic Party failed to achieve in the early 1980s? Perhaps. I remain a little skeptical. If you look at sort of modern British history, the British ruling elite has been very, very good at handling populist anger. Populist anger on the left, but also populist anger on the right. And we can, roughly speaking, we can say that Farage expresses that a kind of populist anger on the right. But there have been in the past outpourings of that kind of populist anger on the right, and particularly on the issue of immigration, a long-standing problem that Britain's ruling elite has failed to address, because we had the first iteration of this was with Enoch Powell, when he made his dramatic Rivers of Blood speech in April 1968. This was 1968, so that's 57 years ago, and he was then saying immigration is out of control. Soon we simply won't have a country anymore. The British people will cease to exist. And this, of course, catapulted Powell, who up until then was a kind of obscure Tory politician. He had been a minister. He had been a minister in the government of Harold Macmillan. He was in the shadow cabinet of Edward Heath. And when he made this speech, this electrifying speech that catapulted him into national prominence, he was, of course, promptly fired by Edward Heath from the shadow cabinet. But that didn't do him any harm, because it just became a national figure, and the feelings of the British public over immigration found expression in support for Enoch Powell, and there were massive demonstrations of people chanting his name, and for a while it looked almost inevitable that Enoch Powell would be prime minister. But he made a fatal step, which remains mysterious to this day, but which is that he left the Conservative Party in 1974 on the ground that he couldn't stand as an MP in a party led by Edward Heath, who was an ardent European, ardent Europhile. Edward Heath was the prime minister who had led Britain into the common market, as it was then known. And in the February 1974 general election, Harold Wilson's Labour was promising a referendum on British membership. So Britain was already a member. Nonetheless, Harold Wilson, who was himself pro common market, he said, when Labour wins, we will hold a referendum on the question of membership, and if the vote goes against membership, we will withdraw from the common market. And so Powell said, well, under these circumstances, I have to support Labour because I think there should be a referendum. Well, anyway, he resigned, and he never really was able to get into the forefront of British politics after that. Powell went to Northern Ireland. He became an MP, the Ulster Unionist Party, and still played a prominent role in British political life. But there was never any chance that he could ever be prime minister. And the Tories were under Thatcher, and that they're moving in a different direction. But you can see there that Powell was kind of sidelined, But there were also manifestations of public anger over immigration over the years. So there was, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the National Front became quite a serious political force. This was obviously on a very different level from Powell. Powell was was an intellectual. He had been a classics professor. Of the National Front, this is, these are street people. This is a mobbish, loutish people. But nonetheless, they were gaining support. And what does the British ruling elite do? They pass legislation promising to curtail immigration. And of course, they don't really do anything about it. But nonetheless, they do this. They go through the motions, passing legislation. Yeah, we see the problem. We're definitely going to address it. And then nothing very much happens. And something similar happened to in around, in the early 2000s with the rise of the British National Party. Again, there was concern somehow immigration had again become a painful issue, and the government again promised, well, we're going to crack down on immigration. We're going to restrict it. It's going to be a lot more difficult to get in. Again, nothing very much happens, but it was enough to see off the British National Party, just like it saw off the National Front. And so, and today, if you read the Telegraph, there's already a story about how Keir Starmer's government is proposing, yes, you guessed it, restrictions on immigration. They're going to start cracking down on illegal immigration. They're going to start cracking down on the fraudulent student visas, which are kind of a notorious way of essentially people coming into the country pretending to be students, and cracking down on people coming in on student visas who then get jobs in the various healthcare sectors and so on, helping to drive down wages. So you can see right away that what is the British ruling elite doing in the face of the rise of Nigel Farage? Oh yeah, now that you mention it, immigration really is a problem. We need to do something about it. They've done this before, and it's worked before. So will it work this time? It's anybody's guess. It may not. It may not work. Farage has a certain popularity. People like him. There's the famous comment about him, and he's marketed that he's the person that you want to have a pint with. He seems likable. He's friendly. It doesn't have this sort of really unpleasant prissiness that particularly someone like Keir Starmer has. So so Farage has that appeal. So and there may just be much greater frustration and exasperation with the antics of Britain's ruling elite, so much so that even pretending to do something about immigration isn't going to do the job. So we'll have to see. But it's an interesting development, and that somehow Britain is joining the other countries in its sudden embrace of populist movements. Anyway, thank you very much for tuning in. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.